I know you've been counting down the moments until another episode of the SMC Journal podcast could begin, and guess what? It's your time. I'm Scott Moore, your host. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's all about performance engineering in IT today. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how to optimize Kubernetes deployed applications, making them scale both vertically and horizontally with what's being called multi-dimensional scaling of Kubernetes. And if you've never heard of that before, well, you're going to be educated today. That's probably one of the biggest problems presented to people who are now gung-ho about Kubernetes is not over provisioning. We want performance, but we also don't want to pay more than we have to make that happen. So how do we do that? And how do we scale efficiently? That's what we're going to talk about today. And before we do that, we're going to talk about the sponsors that make this show happen. This episode is sponsored by Micro Focus and the LoadRunner Solutions family. That includes LoadRunner Professional, Enterprise, Cloud, and Developer. You know, performance matters. Did you know that LoadRunner Solutions have the largest community of practitioners in the world? Join that community at community.microfocus.com, scan the QR code, and check out the LoadRunner family page on performance engineering, as well as their YouTube playlist that we've got links for in the show notes on smcjournal.com as well as YouTube. This episode is sponsored by StormForge. The StormForge platform focuses on AI-powered software designed to help DevOps teams release with confidence and help your IT leaders realize the promise of cloud native. That means faster innovation, higher quality, resiliency, scalability, and efficiency. Find out more at stormforge.io. This podcast is sponsored by Orasi Software. For over 20 years, Orasi, a DevSecOps innovator, has helped companies innovate, accelerate, and automate the entire software development lifecycle. Orasi AppSec and Orasi Cloud Solutions and Services offer full lifecycle support and integration to ensure scalability of transformative applications. Also, they're the makers of Orasi Labs, the train anyone, anywhere, anytime AWS cloud-native virtual e-learning platform. Orasi works with hundreds of global brands as customers and partners, including Fortune 500 companies across a variety of industries. Find out more at orasi.com. Okay, how do you make Kubernetes scale vertically and horizontally? I'm glad you asked. A company that is one of the sponsors that we just mentioned, StormForge, their CTO is here to explain how a new feature that they're just launching this week is going to help you do that and make it very easy for you. Let's bring on Patrick Bergstrom of StormForge now. Hey, Patrick, how are you doing, sir?
Good, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm good. I haven't seen you since the Austin Performance Tour meetup event that we had. And
Yeah,
I think that might have been your first week with StormForge as their
that
CTO. Is that
was
right?
that was like my second or third week with the company, and they just flew me down to Austin. And I'm a huge fan of barbecue, so I'm not going to say no to that. And a great chance to hang out with you. It was a great time.
And now you're a veteran of the company already. So
It doesn't take long, right? When they throw you in the trenches and trial by fire and all that jazz. Yeah, it's been great though. It's been fantastic. It's
well,
awesome.
welcome to the podcast today. For those who have never met you or don't know anything about StormForge, why don't you introduce yourself to them and the company?
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. So Patrick Bergstrom, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at StormForge. I've been here now for 6 months, like you said, an old rusty veteran at this point. And StormForge is, it's funny, I've been with enterprises for a very long time. I had like 20 years at the enterprise before coming to StormForge, which is my first startup. And StormForge specializes in leveraging machine learning to essentially right size your workloads in Kubernetes. And so from the very first conversation I had with Matt Provo, our CEO, and he told me kind of what the mission statement was and some of the history of the company, I said, where have you been all my life, right? Like since my days at Optum, my days at Best Buy, this is, automated right sizing of components is something that I've needed ever since back we were doing EC2 instances to run the edge for BestBuy.com, for instance. So yeah, it's a great little product, and it's got a really awesome capability to help reduce cloud waste while increasing the performance of your application.
Well, so you basically have the way I've described your company is you've kind of drawn a line in the sand that says we are all about Kubernetes deployed applications optimizing them, making them efficient, and reducing your cost in the cloud at the same time. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And is that an accurate way to describe it?
Absolutely. You nailed it.
Okay, so having said that, as of this podcast, we are making an announcement today of some sort that I'm going to hear about today. Why don't you tell me about this big news that you have for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So our historically, the way that we've executed optimization of Kubernetes workloads is essentially we replace the VPA. So what we do is we make sure going into a deployment, whether you're testing with our experimentation-based approach, Optimize Pro in a like a stage environment, we'll tell you the right configuration of your Kubernetes environment, the right configuration of your application as you deploy it. And then we can essentially confirm that with Optimize Live, which leverages your observability and your monitoring data to essentially make smart decisions on the actual size of your components that you need for your workload of your individual pods. And that becomes important because as your applications grow, as things change, we all know that the second anything changes in an environment, your performance test is essentially no longer valid. We allow you to continue to monitor that in real time and make real changes in real time to how it's deployed.
Sorry, you mentioned an acronym that I want to make sure everybody's familiar with. For our audience, why don't you describe what you're talking about there? Because we're talking about scaling.
So I had said we replaced the VPA for Kubernetes, which
Right,
is the
VPA.
vertical pod autoscaler. Yep. And so what the vertical pod autoscaler does is it increases or decreases the size of your pods in Kubernetes in a semi-intelligent way, essentially just based on CPU consumption or memory consumption. It can add more resources as necessary. And then the other tool that a lot of organizations leverage to be able to handle bursting with their applications in Kubernetes, again in an automated fashion, is what's called the HPA, which you just hit on, and that's the horizontal pod autoscaler, right? So that's increasing the number of replicas that you have that are supporting your workload once you hit a specific threshold. And what we have found, and one of the reasons why our tool is so critical and so successful in the long term anyway, is because teams tend to, when you have these big Kubernetes clusters and big environments, and folks maybe even are new to Kubernetes, they're getting ready to transfer workloads over to it. They don't know what size replicas they should be using or how many they should deploy. Or if you have a massive cluster where you're running 7,000 workloads, you can't tune every single workload that you're deploying into that cluster. You essentially have to have a cookie cutter recipe that you can deploy across the environment. And as you can imagine, that results in an exorbitant amount of cloud waste. You could solve the problem by throwing human beings at this, but that's a lot of toil. And there's not a single engineer that I know that wakes up in the morning that's excited to go manually tune Kubernetes environments, right? And so what we found very quickly in being able to introduce and right size your pods is that we had customers that said that's fantastic, but like we want to do that with the HPA as well, right? Like how can we do this both ways where we can do bi-directional scaling? We can scale vertically or horizontally depending on your need. And traditionally, for folks that are used to using Kubernetes, or maybe you're not, I think that it's pretty obvious to look at this problem and say, okay, well, if I'm triggering the VPA on CPU and I'm also triggering the HPA on CPU, like those two will thrash, like they'll fight each other to try to solve the problem. And so historically, organizations have to choose: are you going to use the VPA or are you going to use the HPA that you want to automatically scale? And so we're really excited to introduce the newest version of our algorithm in our product because it allows you to leverage the HPA in conjunction with our vertical scaler so you can have the best of both worlds. One of the things that's really critically important when you are using the HPA is trying to determine when you're going to start triggering additional replicas. And especially when you're triggering based on CPU, your goal is to maintain an essentially flat CPU consumption rate, right? We call it your target usage. And so what our algorithm allows us to do is come in and set the size of the pod that you're replicating in conjunction with the fact that you're using the HPA to make sure that you are essentially maximizing the use of your compute and your efficiency to continue to reduce cloud waste and reduce your cloud bill while increasing the performance of your application.
So I think there's several performance engineers that are watching this program right now they're like, well, we haven't gone fully into Kubernetes yet. We're venturing in, we're dipping our toe in the water, or they're in various phases of that. But they're familiar with the terms of vertical scaling and horizontal
Mm-hmm.
scaling with bare metal servers or virtual servers, EC2 instances, for example.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the scaling for using HPA and VPA together in Kubernetes, it would be much more complicated. But is that because we're moving towards microservices and the way we're building applications, it's like micro tuning a lot of things, and there's just more stuff,
Yeah.
or is there some other reason why it's more complex?
Yeah, there's a couple different reasons in my perspective it quickly becomes more complex with Kubernetes, right? Like Kubernetes is essentially designed to be the future of container hosting and platforms. And because of that, the possibilities of what you can do with it are essentially limitless. Part of that challenge, though, is anytime that you open a capability like that up to engineers, is it requires a high level of knowledge and talent and capability in order to be able to do everything that you possibly can with that solution and be successful with it. And so that's one of the goals of our organization is to essentially leverage machine learning and to help human beings solve that day two complexity gap and do it in a way for them that's automated so that they can take full advantage of Kubernetes using both the VPA and the HPA together without having to figure out like how do I do it in a way that prevents thrashing? How do I do it in a way that prevents cloud waste? How do I continue to pursue an elusive promise that the cloud is cheaper, which we all know is not true unless you're taking full advantage of your dynamic scaling capabilities. And that's really what StormForge unlocks is it's an extra 30% of that flexibility where we can help you reduce your usage when you don't need it and then be ready to scale in and add more compute, more memory in the moments that you do.
So we want everything to be performant, but we also want it to be efficient. And that's really what StormForge is trying to help you with is stop over provisioning to just try to have this bigger safety net, but scale efficiently, I guess, is what we're trying to do.
Exactly.
And so we're calling this bi-dimensional scaling of Kubernetes.
Bidirectional scaling. Yep.
Okay. And so has that does that exist anywhere else, or are you the first vendor to be able to do that?
We're the first vendor to be able to do this for you today, which is really exciting. And anytime you can get first to market with a new capability like this, it's super exciting. And especially as I think about my previous persona, like I said, I was a VP at United Health Group at Optum. Um, as that type of persona, when I put that hat on and I look at this capability and I know that there's the potential to knock 30% off of my cloud hosting bill while actually increasing the performance of my application, not reducing it, which that's typically most people consider those mutually exclusive items. Either I'm going to reduce my cloud bill and then I'm going to get slightly worse performance and I'm willing to make that sacrifice. Or if I want better performance, I have to increase my spend in the cloud. With our machine learning capabilities, we can actually do both, which is really exciting.
Wow, so this is big news. So you're hearing it first here on. Tell me more about. I mean, there's other exciting news that's going on with StormForge. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that? I've been hearing some rumors. So
Yeah, we've got some really great partnerships in the work that we're working through right now. The first one and the one that we're really excited about is our AWS partnership. So if you leverage EKS today and you have used the AWS marketplace in the past, you can now find StormForge in the AWS marketplace. So you can purchase our product directly through AWS and get it attached to your EKS solution. And we can help you with scaling and we can help you with optimizing your workloads immediately right out of the gate. And then same thing with Datadog, which is one that I'm personally really excited about with my background in SRE and observability. One of the things that we talk about is the criticality that is having, good observability and just raw telemetry and access to that operational data so that you can make intelligent decisions. So if you leverage Datadog today, you can actually find StormForge in the Datadog marketplace. And we can take that observability that you're collecting with Datadog and turn it into actionability so that we can make and execute recommendations on how to configure your Kubernetes environment in real time so that you don't have to throw human beings at a dashboard to figure out which workload is the most expensive. We have a system that will automatically do it for you.
how long do you think before we're actually at that point where we can say take the wheel in production? Are we there yet?
So with our product, yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have a customer that has on the I don't know how much I can talk about it, but on the essentially on the cusp of thousands of namespaces. And they have come to us with this exact problem. And they said, hey, the only way that we can manage this as a platform operator is that we give everyone a cookie cutter deployment and then we say, here are your resources. And then if they run into issues with the amount of resources that we give them, they come back, they open a ticket, we go in, we manually adjust it and increase it. But if they don't have issues with the amount of resources they have for their pods, they don't say anything. And so you can imagine there's a huge amount of waste in that environment. And so what we're doing is we're deploying Optimize Live, our production environment controller, into their cluster. And then on an automated, ongoing basis, we're going to make recommendations and execute them in production on behalf of this customer to save them on cloud waste and to optimize and make their applications run more efficiently. They're very excited about it.
Oh, well, it does sound exciting. That's very. That sounds like a use case that's going to be documented as a big win, but in the future, hopefully. All right, so I want to veer off on a rabbit trail just a little bit and talk about something that I saw from you on LinkedIn. It was a personal post that you had, and I want to mention it because several people actually told me that they saw this and they thought it was a really good posting, and I want to bring it up. This is a post that you did on LinkedIn about a week ago,
Mm-hmm.
and so it says on the subject of leadership and technology, rockstar individual contributors do not always become rockstar leaders. There's a significantly different skill set required to do this.
Yeah. Thank you, by the way, for that compliment. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned early on, I come from a background at giant corporations. And as most people can imagine, they tend to be just a little bit slower to pick up on some of these things that have been present in the tech industry for a while. This is something that I've seen firsthand. And this was, granted, this was 15, 16 years ago, but it still exists. And that's one of those things where if you have someone that is performing, say, in a senior engineer role, a senior software engineer role, or even just a software engineer role, they have a desire to grow, and they have a desire to, especially if they've been with the organization that they're with for a long time, which you see a lot in the enterprise where someone will be there for 5, 10, 15 years because they're loyal to the brand, which is absolutely fantastic. Oftentimes at some of those organizations, though, if they're really, really good at what they do and they want to continue to grow, they often are told, hey, if you want to get promoted again, you're already a senior. The only other thing that we can do is we can make you a manager, and then you can be a director if you want. And then maybe you can continue to grow from there. That works for some people. Like, it's one of those things where it's a balance between EQ and IQ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a really good software engineer that has just a ton of IQ, but maybe they don't have a ton of EQ, they might not be successful doing that. And to tell them that they're capped out in their career because they've reached the pinnacle of individual contributorship, I think is a crime for that organization. And you're going to lose some of your best employees if you try to force them into that. Or even worse, if they say no and they remain stagnant and they feel betrayed by the organization. But just as bad as if they say, yes, okay, I'll try it, and then they're not successful. And then they take a hit to their personal confidence, and they think, well, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was because I was a really good developer, but obviously I'm not good at teaching other people that. So was I ever really a good developer to start with? And that's one of those things where I think it's critically important that in order to take care of your people, you have to provide them the opportunity for growth and the opportunity to be challenged in new ways. That doesn't necessarily include taking on HR responsibilities and having direct reports. And there was a couple other posts that I've made in the last 2 weeks, and I think one of them was kind of in the same line too, where I had talked about how you have to challenge them in ways that are useful for them, that allow them to grow in a direction that they want to go. But more importantly, you have to take care of your people first and foremost. Because if you take care of your people, then the results will follow. Versus if you're managing the metrics and you're trying to chase down results, and then you're pushing people to get to those results, that's where you run into high levels of burnout. That's where people feel like they're just a cog in the machine. And frankly, I think that their level of contributions will start to suffer, or worst case, they'll go find a manager that they do want to work for, and they'll leave the organization, which isn't good either. And it's interesting too, because one of the things that I always tell my managers and my direct reports, or really anybody in my organization that will listen to me, is that I want them to be successful regardless of what that means as it relates to our relationship. So if they don't want to work for my organization anymore, like, I will help them find a job somewhere else, because I want them to be challenged and I want them to be happy when they come into work every day, whether or not they're working for me. I had a lot of success with that at Optum. I had a lot of success with that at Best Buy. And it's one of those things where there's more than one occasion where I'll send somebody out into the world to work at a different company. They'll learn a new skill set, and then they'll bring that skill set back to me 2, 3, 4 years later, and we reconnect. So frankly, I've had a lot of success with it, which I think is great.
I know I've personally experienced feeling like that cog in the machine. I know a lot of it. That's where a lot of performance testers are wondering, like, where do they go when
Yeah.
they start dipping into the, I want to be an engineer, because they want to provide more value. And I think a culture that says, that makes people motivated, that at review time they come to their boss and saying, how can I provide you with more value so that I'm more valuable to the organization, and you feel that I'm providing that value that makes you want to, look out for me, pay me more money, whatever that is that makes a difference.
Yeah.
But it sounds like a really cool culture that you're building there at Stormforge, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I think, and the culture is, it's really important to me, frankly, right? And I think we've all been there, or at least we know of somebody that's been in a situation where they're really, really good at their job and they're trying to get promoted, and their boss says, "No, I need you here. You're too good," right? And so that doesn't work either. And that's, you're exactly right. I think the culture of servant leadership, and essentially me acting as that servant to my staff and making sure that I'm here to remove their roadblocks to get them whatever it is they need to be successful, it pays dividends at the end of the day.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I know we drifted off a little bit from performance engineering, but to be a performance engineer and to feel like that in an organization in a good way with what you're building, I think that's really important. And people in my field need to hear that. So I thought that was really important.
Yeah.
So
Performance engineering in particular, like that's one of those disciplines where sometimes it's hard for senior leaders to see the value. And so they do run into that on a regular basis. And it's one of those things where I actually would argue that's one of the more critical parts of operations that people just, they don't give enough time and attention to. So
yeah, so I completely agree with that. Thus, the reason why I guess this show exists. So, Patrick, thank you so
absolutely.
much for being on today's show. It was very good, and I hope to have you back on. You're welcome to come back anytime and talk about what's going on. And this is a big deal for the announcement of StoreForge. And thank you for presenting it on our program today.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure, Scott. It's always great to chat with you, and I look forward to the next one.
All right, thanks. Bye bye. So, as you can see, in the world of Kubernetes, there is a lot of excitement because there's so much activity going around as we all figure out the Kubernetes puzzle and how to make it work efficiently and how to make it performant, make it resilient, all of these things. And you're going to hear on this show and others like it that deal with performance, there's going to be a lot more news coming out over the next few months as companies continue to add these additional features like what you've heard today. Do you like what you're hearing? I'd like to hear your feedback on this program and other programs as well. I'm easy to find. If you go to my website, scottmoore.consulting, you can find my links to social media. LinkedIn profile is there, as well as my Twitter handle, Load Tester, or you can also just send me an email at help@scottmoore.consulting. Where are you in regards to Kubernetes today? Are you just entering into that? Are you migrating to it? Are you starting off and that's all you do is Kubernetes deployed applications, and you don't even have any what we might call legacy applications to even worry about? I'd like to know your experience with it, and are you having trouble scaling it out? Is this a feature that would just is going to totally transform your world and make it so much better for you? I'd like to know that. Let me know. If you like this kind of content, it would be great if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring the bell so that you'll know when new episodes come out, so you won't just be waiting and not knowing. They come out generally twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So subscribe and you'll know exactly when it comes out the next time, and we'll continue to make episodes for you. So thank you, StormForge, for being on the show. And until the next episode of the SMC Journal, this is Scott Moore saying thank you for watching, and bye-bye.